Welcome to the No Unfinished Business podcast. There are 1,000 different ways your clients can leave unfinished business, but no single advisor can address every issue. In every episode, we'll answer the important questions to help professional advisors focused on individual clients. Attorneys, CPAs, and financial advisors identify and eliminate those planning blind spots so you can speak competently and confidently to your clients and help them leave no unfinished business. Justin Miller, it is great to see you. How are you today, my friend?
I am doing just wonderfully. John, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Great. Well, Justin, we have you on today not to talk about what could go wrong with mistitling or not updating beneficiary designations, but to think about how can we as advisors actually get clients to do the things we need them to do. Because it doesn't matter if you're an attorney or a CPA or a financial advisor, we all have clients who are less than enthused or just say they have almost anything better to do than that stupid paperwork that their professional advisors have for them.
I call it estate planning paralysis. And the reality is, look, we want to help our clients. We know as advisors, this is good for them. It's the right thing to do. It's our civic duty almost. I mean, we certainly, charge them for our time and our advice and our work, but, we truly believe that this would help them. And you just sometimes get this paralysis. So, if you're fortunate, it might only be one or two clients. For some of us, this might be the majority of our clients. But it is a challenge. And so the real focus, hopefully for today, what we'll talk about is, what are some concrete steps, some actions you can take as an advisor to help your clients move forward, to actually take action, to implement their plans.
All right, Justin. So we've got this wonderful plan, and now we need to implement it because clients think they've signed it, they're done. They can, it's like the couch they purchased 7 years ago. It fits in this house. It'll fit in the house they move into in a few years. And when their kids are ready, they'll just give it to them for their first apartment. They don't really need to think about it anymore.
Well, I'll even take it a step back. You've at least gotten them to sign the documents. I mean, maybe we haven't done all the transfers, but I mean, sometimes part of the challenge is how do we even get your clients to get to the point where they're signing the documents, where they're actually agreeing, talk about, implementing the plan that's been drafted and signed. I mean, you're kind of jumping. We have clients that, it's hard to even get them to that point. So I'll start. I kind of break it down into 3 steps. So why don't we just start with step number 1? Step number 1 is, if you were to really break it down, and maybe I'll ask you this question, John, would you rather have a client that needs a solution or a client that wants a solution?
I would rather have the client who wants the solution. And I think that the key difference being they are invested in solving the problem.
Absolutely. Great answer. And by the way, none of this was prearranged. I put John on the spot. Probably last time he'll invite me on any of these podcasts. But you're absolutely right. And chances are, if they want a solution, it's a given. They need it too. They don't want to just pay you just for fun. But you're absolutely right. We want a client to want it. So how do we make that connection? And so I'm going to start with step 1. And step 1, I'll call it investigation. How do we find out what the client really needs? What is it we're trying to solve for from just a mathematical equation? And how do we translate that need into a want? And part of what you want to do, so as step 1, part of your investigation is you want to ask very specific questions. And you don't want to jump to solutions. And the questions you want to ask translate for the client into, by them answering your question, they will not only tell you what they need, they will realize that they want a solution. So you're kind of accomplishing 2 things, not just figuring out their explicit need. You're letting them think to themselves, oh no, this is a problem. It's my problem, not my advisor's problem, but I really want this advisor to do me a favor and help me solve this problem. And I'll give you a few examples. An example would be, oftentimes we see a client and we can talk to them about needing to update their plan and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act changes and portability, and it'll just go right over their head. That's us thinking they need a solution. We don't really know that they need one, and they haven't told us they want a solution. So how do you create that worry, that anxiety? So I'll actually go back a step and even give you some studies on the issue. And there have been studies on asking questions. A lot of it comes from sales. And some of the older, decades old research found that when people ask yes or no questions, closed-ended questions, you're less likely to make a sale than if you ask an open-ended question that a person can't answer with a yes or a no. And the research found that engages people's brains. They start to think. It means they want something more. But when it comes for estate planning advice, you can't just ask open-ended questions. That won't lead you anywhere. Like if you have a client and say, hey, tell me about your business or how's your business going, they'll talk for 3 hours and you're not going to accomplish anything. So what's an open-ended question that gets a client to tell you what they need so that they will actually want a solution? So I'll share a few and we can all create our own and come prepared. So one example would be, if you were incapacitated, how would your wishes be met? And really, when we talk about estate plans, it's not, and powers of attorney and all of this trust, it's not just what happens after you're dead. I mean, for a lot of clients, when you're dead, you're dead. Let's start right off the bat with what happens if you need help? What happens if you're in the hospital? What happens if with your money during your lifetime, if you aren't able to control it, whether temporarily or permanently? And then if a client can't answer that question, I think what that means is they probably need to review their documents, maybe even update them. And the reality is, if I just went to a client and said, you need to update your documents in case you're incapacitated, they don't want that answer. I don't know if it's the right fit. But by asking them the question of, if you were incapacitated, how would your wishes be met? That's shifting the problem from me to them. It allows them to articulate, uh-oh, I don't know what's going to happen, and that really bothers me. So that would just be an example. I'll throw out a couple more, John, and then we can move on. Or it would be things like,
right. Well, I mean, so it's not just the Justin monologue. I mean, one of the things I ask clients about is, if you're not here to tell us whether it's you're dead or you're just incapacitated, will anybody be able to find your stuff? Just the simple act of, where are your bank accounts? What bank do you use? I don't, I happen to know the bank that my sister uses because we both use the same bank. But for most people, they wouldn't have any idea really. Well, I think 20 years ago when John moved to Austin, he opened an account at University Federal Credit Union. So we should probably search there if something happened to him. But for a lot of our clients, just the act of getting them to think about, if somebody wasn't here, could they figure out where your stuff is?
Yeah, I mean, especially when you get into electronic digital assets, passwords, access, not just what do you own, where is it all located? And what about even finding out, so a lot of times people have these goals, these desires, these objectives that, especially some charitable clients, they want certain things to happen. If they haven't written them down, are they going to happen? But by posing it in terms of a question, rather than just telling them, you need to do X, Y, and Z, that doesn't inspire them to act. By asking them a question of whether or not they're ready, meaning, have you documented your charitable goals? That shifts the problem to them. They have to think to answer that question. And really what they're going to do is they're going to tell you whether or not they actually have a problem, whether it's an explicit need of theirs. And if it is, I can assure you they are exponentially more likely to look at you and say, uh-oh, I need help with this. Will you help me?
Right. And I mean, one of the things I like to explain and use as clients when we start is, if it's a married couple with kids and no real kind of complicating factors, I already know that their plan is going to look like all to your spouse, otherwise to the kids in roughly equal shares. And they all nod and say, yeah, that's what we want. It's like, well, clearly I knew that already. But it's thinking about, that is the 2-year-old's crayon drawing of a house. And what we really need to build your financial, your estate plan or whatever it is, we need architectural diagrams and probably some soil samples. And, our job as the professional advisors is to get them from the crayons to the blue lines. And this is the process we have to kind of talk you through. And I like that we're getting to the emotional crutch of why they're doing this. It's not just, oh, it'll be fine. But first, we're starting with, well, why are we getting there?
Absolutely. And actually, John, you sort of lead into my magical step number two.
Also,
And you were
not
just
planned.
gave it without even knowing it. By the way, once again, none of this pre-prepared. I didn't even tell John my 3 steps to start with, but
Yeah.
we've got our step 1 down. And let's say we've got great questions. The client has answered them. They clearly now they're owning their own problems. They're realizing they need your help. Well, that gets us to step number 2, and that is, how do we communicate our solutions? How are we writing them down, documenting them, explaining them? And once again, I'll share with you the research. What are the 2 best ways to communicate, the optimal ways for advisors to communicate? And I'm going to give you 2 of them.
Okay.
Just to give you your money's worth today. So number 1, why don't we start with stories?
Okay.
Stories. Research has shown that stories, they're persuasive, they're compelling, and they're memorable. So now you know the client needs some assistance. They want your assistance. When you have these solutions, try to tell them in terms of stories. I mean, don't use other client names. I mean, keep that client, but tell similar examples. This is the beauty of all of us having work experience. Find a similar type of client or a similar thing that you've solved for, or a similar way where they didn't take your advice or should have taken your advice and it didn't go the way they wanted. Those are persuasive. People will remember that. Don't get me wrong. I teach law school. I can talk about the code and regulations for 2.5 hours to students about why they should do something for estate and GST tax purposes. That's not going to convince a client to implement their plan. But a story about what happens or what could happen to a family, or best case scenario versus worst case scenario, that's why it works. In fact, I'll share with you even more research. There was a study done, Princeton, 2010, where they actually hooked the storyteller and the listeners up to MRI machines and measured their brain activity. And what they found was, as the storyteller was telling the story, same parts of the brain would light up in the storyteller and the listener at the same time. So, or right after, meaning the storyteller. So it showed that we as humans connect on a biological level when we tell stories. This is how, before we even had written word and books, this is how people communicated generation after generation. In fact, what the study got even more interesting, this Princeton study, was as the storyteller kept going with the story, that the audience began to anticipate where the storyteller was going, and the different parts in their brain were lighting up before the storyteller even got there. So this biological connection, and just some more research is the most impactful stories are the ones that elicit an emotional response. And if it elicits an emotional response, it is exponentially more likely to lead to action. So before I go to my magic communication number 2, thoughts on stories, John?
Well, yeah, and it's not, trying to pick my words here, but it's not just saying, don't do this or you will pay tax. It's, I understand there are a lot of things going on. Here's one way it has not worked out. Carrot and the stick might be it. Here's one client who avoided all of this by getting everything signed, or thinking about the client I have right now who's been sitting on draft documents for about 3 years, and I want him to be done as much as, probably more than anybody else, clearly more than him. But coming back with if something happens, you don't have anything in place. And, right now, how do we communicate that to him, thinking it's, well, we're probably just going to be, drafting weekly email stories. Dear Bill, here's what happened when somebody didn't sign their will, and just, turning that into maybe even like an autoresponder where, I don't want to just call him up and, hey, Bill, I was just thinking, here's this, but the email story week after week.
Yeah, the reality is, we all have, at least, like I said, that one client or many clients, and sometimes they'll even say, oh, my kids or grandkids will get plenty of money, and, oh, what do I care? The government will take its piece, and I just don't want to deal with the hassle and aggravation. But when you tell them the stories of how it can actually make things worse, you might actually cause your children who get along now, adult children, you might actually create the reason that they're fighting. You might make things worse. You might be causing a problem for them. They might end up suing each other. And whether or not you just name them as serving as co-trustees together, or whether you just make them fight over the tangible personal property. But stories are the way that we can communicate as humans. And like I said, this is all about what are practical steps you can take to increase the likelihood that a client will implement the plan. But stories aren't enough. We'll give one more, and you mentioned sort of, John, earlier about drawing and really laying it out. We especially as advisors, tax people love to use numbers, lawyers love to use words, but we often forget there are two real types of people. There are what we sometimes call left brain people, mathematical, logical. A lot of attorneys and accountants, engineers, and then as my wife likes to remind me, there's everyone else in the world, and they are more right-brained people. They're artistic, visual. They like to see. They use their eyes. Now, all of this comes from the original research was Roger Sperry, who won the Nobel Prize in 1981. And he originally did this research working on split brain patients. Now, unless you have teenagers, we're not really dealing with people that have half a brain. So for those of you that have kids with teenagers, different story. But our clients, most people, they're using both left and right brain, but they tend to appreciate or favor one way of learning versus the other. And we often forget that in addition to stories, we need to use visuals. And I'll just share with you even the behavioral research on it. And really, what's the goal of everything we're doing in communicating? And it's all about keeping it simple. The KISS principle. And this gets back even to behavioral economics. A couple, I love Nobel Prize winners. Look, they win a Nobel Prize for a reason. So you've got Richard Thaler. He said something like, if you want to encourage someone to do something, make it easy. And then you also have one of my favorites, Danny Kahneman. He wrote, and unfortunately, Amos Tversky passed away before getting a Nobel Prize. But at least Kahneman, he wrote, people will eventually gravitate to the least demanding course. So if we want to help our clients, maybe this is a way to raise kids too, maybe training pets, but we want to make it easy. And the best ways to communicate and make it easy, stories and visuals. And that means flow charts, pictures. It doesn't mean, rip up your words. It doesn't mean don't do the mathematical analysis, but ultimately add that visual element. And like I said, all of these are practical things you can do as advisors to exponentially increase the chance of implementation.
And, here's a story that involves a diagram. This morning, I was talking with a trustee. They have an estate on their hands where they need to start funding some trusts after first spouse's death, knowing that the second spouse is, given a long enough timeline, not going to be with us. And then we're going to have to pay estate tax. We're going to have to fund some trusts, and communicating this to the kids, the grandkids, and the great grandkids of what's out there and where did it go for a sizable estate. It's not just going to be, hey, you're going to get, X dollars. It's showing when grandpa died, here's what he owned. Grandma had this, and then we funded these trusts, and this is, this payment came off to the IRS when grandpa died because of the way the plan was structured. And we know that we're going to fund some, GST exposed gifts, that those are going to drain off some GST. And so that pot's going to end up there, and we're going to have these other trusts coming out. And then we're going to layer in, these are the assets you have to pay these bills. And if we start selling things now, we'll have one problem. And if we wait until, grandma dies, we're going to have a different set of problems. But showing here's where, starting to map out, because it's going to have to be a combination of the charts plus the numbers to factor into the future. But really, the story all the advisors have already told themselves is there are a lot of knives in a lot of family members' hands, and we're all going to, if we don't get this clear now, those knives will be coming out. The other great phrase that I learned this morning and never really thought of, they had made some initial, interim distributions, and the best sheath for a knife is cash.
Well, if anything, the best protection of all we're talking about, and that is visual.
Yep,
By
visual.
all of what you're talking about, really getting back into just putting it up into one slide that you can put up on a screen or print out and put in front of all of your clients. That so many words, such difficult concepts, but if they see it in picture form, they don't have to know about generation skipping, transfer tax, and how it's calculated. But if they can see a box that has a different color, and that's your GST box, I'm sure we've all heard the saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. When it comes to trusts, I would say a picture is worth 100,000 words. I don't know if you've actually gone and counted the words, and when you start looking at the credit shelter and the survivors trust and the decanting and all these other trusts, you can actually go into Microsoft Word. They'll tell you how many words are in a document. And so I would change that saying for trust and estates. A picture is worth 100,000 words.
And that is why for the last 4+ years, we've started with, we're sending you these PowerPoint slides up front. This is what we use to guide our discussion. It's got words in there, but it's broken down so people can see. And when we're meeting with them, we can draw boxes in PowerPoint to show where stuff goes. And it does make it so much easier because people see it. And like, I don't need them to know how we calculate tax, but we have now started, here's what we think your tax bill is going to be over the next 10 years if both of you die in this second year. And it just, the simple line graph, it's got 2 lines. A lot of people, good news and bad news, that line is straight on the floor. A lot of people, good news and bad news, they're jagged, and it depends on when you're dying.
Well, I'll tell you, so maybe this good time, I'll jump into step number 3. I promised
Perfect.
you a 3-step process. So let's say we've got the first, some people probably, maybe we've wasted 15 minutes of their life and they say, Justin, John, thank you, but I already do that. I have great questions. Clients tell me what they explicitly need. They tell me they want a solution. And, thanks for reminding me. I always use great stories and I use tons of visuals. But I still have that client or certain clients, I want to help them and they're not taking action. What am I missing? And that brings us to step number 3. And that is, it's not enough to investigate. It's not enough to communicate. Step number 3, we have to motivate. So 3 steps: investigate, communicate, and motivate. We've got to motivate people to take action, and not just down the road or eventually, hey, it'd be a great idea. I mean, the reality is for a lot of these plans, as long as you do it before you die, I mean, if you're not really doing big estate and GST tax planning, you could just sign it really the day before you die. But the problem is we don't know what that day is going to be. So how do we motivate, let alone when it's a wealthier client and there could be huge tax benefits for doing something sooner rather than later? Well, I'll start with the mistake that I see with a lot of advisors. The mistake I see in motivation is that a lot of people say, you need to do this because we know you're going to die one day. It's a fact. And the reality is, it is true you're going to die, but death is not a motivating factor. When you hear the word death, when a client hears the word death, the first thing they're thinking about is, oh, I'm going to die. I better get all my affairs in order. I better sign these documents and really talk to an attorney and an accountant. Really, they're thinking about loved ones and places and they want to see, things they might want to do. I'll give you a few exceptions, though, where death is a motivator. And that would be, if it just so happens that they have like a relative or a friend that died, they might, they left behind a mess. Maybe they'll think, hey, you know what? I better get my own affairs in order. If they've just had, they're about to have surgery, maybe they're afraid, like, oh my gosh, there really is a chance I could die. Another one that I've seen, and John, probably you as well, where, families are leaving their kids for the first time, maybe their first time ever on a plane, leaving their kids, where they come to you and say, I'm leaving in 4 weeks. I need to get this estate plan. If something ever happens to me and my spouse. But those, you can't create those motivating factors. Like, right. You can't. The
imminent threat of death, not the theoretical threat of death.
Right. So if death isn't really a motivating factor, unless you kind of time it and one of those factors come up, then what does motivate? And I'll just share with you kind of what are a few things that are motivating? Well, instead of talking about death, maybe talk about incapacity, especially if it's an older client. I mean, the statistics show 80% of older Americans, 65 and older, have some sort of chronic condition, hypertension, high cholesterol, heart disease, arthritis, you name it. In fact, more than half have 2 or more of those conditions. 70% of older Americans, older adults, they need help with your everyday living activities of daily living, ADLs, eating, dressing, bathing. Elder abuse is one of the quickest growing crimes in this country, and often goes unreported. And it's not just about getting older. It could be car accidents, and it's not just about you driving the car. You could be a passenger in the car. You could be a pedestrian walking down the street. A few more motivating factors that I know we talk about, but we can maybe show with visuals for wealthier clients. The exemption amount. Show them what it looks like in a picture form about what that exemption amount being cut in half. And we know that there's at least no clawback except for potentially abusive transactions. But the idea that you can gift now and that's going to go away after 2025. Interest rates, we know they're going up. They're at 3.6% for September. If you go back historically and we're seeing inflation, I don't know if we're going to go back there, but we used to have double-digit interest rates. A lot of these recommendations and strategies, they wouldn't work back then. They work now because we're in a lower interest rate environment. But I'll share with you 2 more. So at least everyone, once again, giving money's worth. The 2 motivating factors that I personally think are, along with everything I said, 2 important ones to remember. And that is, we like to run the numbers and we like to put it on our visuals and we show them the tax savings and, hey, you should really do this. And especially with a lot of business owners, they're very, very busy executives where they say, this is great, I'll get around to it eventually. So it's not enough to just show the benefit of acting right now. What we need to show is the cost of procrastination. And that is, you don't have to do everything today. Let's just take a client. I'll use a decently wealthy family, $40 million, and you run the numbers and they owe a little bit more than $6 million in estate taxes or something like that. And they could do some discounting and things like that. But the reality is you run these numbers and then you say, you know what? You don't have to do anything today. Why push them, even though the attorneys and accountants and advisors want them to do it? But why don't you also run the numbers to show them what kind of tax liability that they are going to have 10 years from now? What's going to happen 10 years from now? So the reality is, yeah, you've got maybe a $6+ million tax issue today. 10 years from now, let's just assume 7% growth. Reasonable for a lot of businesses that are doing better than that. Well, 10 years from now, you're not going to have a $6 million estate tax problem. You might have a $25 million estate tax problem if you don't solve this today. And not only that, what I really love to do, cost of procrastination, break it down by month. Break it down by month and say, you know what, not only is it 26 million 10 years from now, make it real, especially for clients that understand cash flow. You don't have to do anything. It'll only cost you in taxes an extra, $160,000 a month for the next 10 years to not do anything. But it's totally your choice from a motivating factor.
Right. And it's something that we've talked about in other episodes, but I've called it my 4 horsemen of the estate planning apocalypse. And you've hit on several of them, losing assets, family frustration, or just the mess generally. Future fights that we might be able to head off. And one of my friends who is a litigator has said, just take 10% off the top for the litigators. And that's what a, plus or minus an average fight is going to cost. And then finally, it's just the other unforced errors of cost. So more tax than you'd have to pay. It doesn't mean you pay nothing, but we can lower that. It might also be, dying with California probate. That is an unforced cost error that you can minimize by funding your trust. And, while probate here in Texas is not so bad, our filing fees, the total filing fees are generally between $600 and $1,000. It doesn't mean you want to jump through that hoop if we can minimize it.
Oh, absolutely. And that's really what we're doing here today. This is the whole point of these 3 steps: investigate, communicate, motivate, is to really make it better for the whole family, to really take some of those risks and elements and negatives away. And at least I want to end with sort of my final motivator. And this is the beauty of having attorneys, working with accountants, working with wealth managers and trust advisors. And that is the advisors need to be a collaborative team. If you really want to assure the exponentially highest likelihood that a client is going to implement the plan, they should be hearing the same great advice from all their advisors who are working together. Now, it doesn't mean they all work at the same firm. It's not some bias that you do have independent advisors at different firms, but I'll tell you what, if the wealth manager, someone like me at a good wealth management firm, if the attorney, someone like John, if the accountant are all coming together and they're saying this is the right plan, chances are it is the right thing to do and much more likely to motivate that client to take action. And you can just add people to that team. You know, it could be a property and casualty insurance, could be life insurance, could be a corporate attorney, M&A attorney, whatever it is. But if you get those advisors working together, being collaborative, it doesn't mean they all agree 100%, but if you can come up with the plan that they all agree is the overall best plan, and that's the beauty of joining organizations, local estate planning councils, or having these types of groups, just make sure whatever clients you have and that you're sharing with outside advisors, make sure you're the one reaching out. And I, you know, especially with business owners, we do come from time to time that we see this with business owners a lot where they like to silo their advisors. They want to play them against each other and they think that's how they're going to get the best advice. And I'm not going to tell them. And what happens sometimes, from my perspective, is it's not that necessarily the advisors disagree. It's that they're operating off different information and assumptions. Where just the other day, I had the accountant recommending a GRAT, but the attorney was recommending a sale to intentionally defective grantor trust. Now, we can run the numbers for both. We can do the visuals. We can talk about clients that do one or the other. But what was missing, to tie it all together, was that the client was planning for GST purposes for grandchildren. And the accountant who was going the GRAT route did not have the full set of information that the attorney did. And that's where the GRAT was not the ideal solution, because they didn't have all the information. So, and if you really want your best likelihood, exponentially highest likelihood, if you are going to implement this process, make sure you're working with all the other advisors.
Right. And, you know, beyond that, I can remember a few years ago, I was looking at a family with about 27 million. They had $6 million in death benefits for life insurance. I'm like, oh, this is the easy answer. Let's get this transitioned out. Well, the financial advisor was pretty clear. They had, you know, income replacement issues that they were just very nervous. They didn't want to give that away because they want to take a loan from that policy. They want to take a loan from that policy. They're willing to accept that risk. They will be able to better evaluate their risks and their needs and what they're comfortable with than me. And that's totally fine. I'm happy to, you know, say, yes, we'll leave that on your balance sheet for now. It's, you know, we'll have whatever it is, we'll have whatever consequences, but you're comfortable with that. And I'm not taking away a source of security for you, which is great. The other thing is, look, I can pick up the phone and call you and have a 5-minute conversation, and then we can go back to the client and have perhaps a 10 or 15-minute conversation. But what we're not going to do is I'm going to have a 15-minute conversation explaining something to the client, who then has to process it, kind of spew out a bunch of jargon to you, Justin, and then you're trying to put the pieces back together, and they hear, oh, well, John was talking about some TGV planning. I was like, no, we're not going very quickly between France and London. But that sort of thing where we know what it is, we can just talk and say, I think this, not that. Oh, okay, we know why, and this is how we can put the pieces together faster for our clients.
Yeah, well, clearly we're on the same page, John, and hopefully with this podcast and videos that we're helping other advisors kind of learn from our mistakes, our successes. And ultimately, we all want hopefully we all want what's best for our clients. And if anything today, you know, I'll just sort of cap it off with a reminder. What are these 3 steps that we've got, you know, what's going to increase our chances of helping our client overcome estate planning paralysis? Number 1, how do you investigate? What are the questions you're asking? Are you getting the client to tell you what they explicitly need, so they'll want a solution? Number 2, how are you communicating? In addition to these words, and of course, I'm a big fan of financial analysis. That's what I like to see. But are we also using stories? Are we using visuals, flow charts, pictures? And then last but not least, are we motivating the client, not just to implement eventually, but why they need to put this into place today? What is the cost of procrastination? What happens if they don't take action? And hopefully we're helping others. So John, any final thoughts from you?
No, Justin, we've had a lot of fun with this today. People are looking to reach out and talk with you. Where can they find you?
Well, I'll tell you the easiest place to find me. I'm at Justin Miller. I'm at Evercore Wealth Management. You can easily just Google my name, Evercore Wealth Management, and find me. The other thing that I have a lot of fun with, and I know John does as well, check me out on LinkedIn. Check both of us out. And if you really want sort of the stuff that doesn't quite make it to LinkedIn, I'm also on Twitter as well. It's the @ Justin Miller ESQ. And if anything, if you do happen to go to LinkedIn or Twitter, I will apologize in advance for my questionable attempts at humor. They're not inappropriate. They're just kind of bad jokes, but it's not easy to come up with good tax jokes. I do my best.
At this point, you've run through a lot of the good ones.
All right, John, thanks so much for having me here today. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Justin.